Hello and welcome to the April 2022 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Juliette Faure, who's a political scientist at Sciences Po in Paris and a specialist in Russian political elites. Juliette has a piece in this month's paper entitled The Deep Ideological Roots of Russia's War, in which she looks at the ways in which right-wing ideologues have influenced Vladimir Putin's view of Russia and its place in the world since he came to power in 2000. She highlights in particular the Izborsk Club, a sort of right-wing think tank, as the engine driving the project of so-called national patriotism. She's keen to emphasise, though, that the influence of these ideologues of the right has waxed and waned over the past 2 decades. It's not an ineluctable linear progression. Putin has shown a readiness to pick and choose the ideological components that suit his immediate purposes best. Nonetheless, Juliette writes that most recently, hybrid authoritarianism that combined multiple ideological factions has given way to a highly repressive regime, imposing an imperialist, warlike state culture. In other words, Putin has nailed his colours to the mast. There can be no going back now. How did Russia get here? Juliette traces the rise of national patriotism back to the era of perestroika in the mid-1980s and highlights the influence of a publication called Zavtra, tomorrow in Russian, that in the 1990s injected a set of ideas associated with it into the nation's political bloodstream. I began by asking her to tell me more.
So Zavtra was the rallying platform for a group of Russian conservatives that we can call the National Patriarchs, and to whom the restoration of Russia's great power had to come with military and civilizational confrontation with the West. So Zavtra's columnists included a wide range of people, including Stalin supporters, nationalists, monarchist Orthodox priests, or even Muslim traditionalists. And some of the famous names, like some of the popular Zavtra contributors, included the Eurasian thinker Alexander Dugin, the National Bolshevik writer Edward Limonov, or the Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov. And this very eclectic group, in fact, gathered around a common rejection of the post-Soviet democracy, economic liberalization, the power of the oligarchs, the westernization of the Russian society, and also the US dominance over the international order. The National Patriots, as a political ensemble, had a common dream, which is to rebuild a strong state that would combine the traditional spiritual values of the Tsarist Imperial Russia with the Soviet Union's military and technological might.
So they begin as this kind of oppositional force. They don't like the direction Russia is taking under Yeltsin. And they don't form a political party, but they do begin to have some political influence. We begin to see some of the things they're discussing, some of the ideas they're putting forward, begin to enter the sort of mainstream. And I wondered, when does that begin to happen? And in what ways does the national patriotic kind of idea enter the mainstream political discourse in Russia?
So at the beginning of the 1990s, the National Patriots organized mass demonstrations against Boris Yeltsin's regime. And in 1993, those demonstrations were actually military crushed by the army upon Yeltsin's order during the October constitutional crisis. However, this crisis was followed by a conservative turn in Boris Yeltsin's regime, which started to use some of the national patriotic ideas in official speech. So some of these key ideas were, for instance, the justification of strong state power, the promotion of a national ideology, or the celebration of Russia's cultural and religious traditions. So, for instance, when the Chechen War broke out in 1994, the government tried to build a new state patriotism. And again, in 1996, Yeltsin set up a government commission to define a quote-unquote national idea for post-Soviet Russia.
And quite a lot of those characteristics that you've just enumerated will sound quite familiar to people from what they know of Putin. So he comes to power in 2000. And, we're familiar with this idea of the vertical of the power, where he is at the top and all sort of critical decisions go up to him. And I wondered, a sort of general question, does it make sense, do you think about Putin in terms of ideology, to discuss how he sees the world and then how he enacts policy in terms of ideology? Because we're not really familiar with sort of thinking about it in exactly those terms.
Right. So it is true that I think starting from Vladimir Putin's second mandate, which starts in 2004, some of those Russian ideologues, Russian conservative ideologues, were brought in the Kremlin to contribute to some of the ideological counterattacks that the Kremlin sought to organize against the pro-Western color revolutions that were happening throughout the post-Soviet countries. So, for instance, Putin's political party, United Russia, invited people like Dugin and Prokhanov. So those are among the most radical conservative ideologues. So the party invited them to address the pro-governmental youth movements such as Nashi or Molodaya Gvardia. Now, the way I see it is that the use of these ideologues by the Kremlin has been actually quite circumstantial and also interactional, that is, in relation to the influence of other groups. And I think it's important today not to abide totally by a teleological narrative that would, I feel this theological view of Putin's ideological radicalization is becoming more and more widespread now that we wake up after the war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, we look back and we think that this war was actually the fatal end result of a long, continuous ideological radicalization of the regime. But actually, having followed the career of the National Patriarchs ideas over the past 30 years, I can say that their progression was not linear, but rather went through up and down cycles. And there are, of course, certain constant factors, certain constant variables, one of them being the need for strong authoritarian state justification that have been there throughout the period. But the dynamics of promotion or demotion of ideologues by the Kremlin was driven by contextual shifting power relations between different elite groups and different systems of thought.
I think it's really interesting what you've said about resisting a teleological explanation, because it seems to me as though a lot of commentary has gone from saying we had no idea this could possibly happen to then saying, oh, but if you go and look at this particular document, or if you look at this particular book by Dugin, you'll see it all laid out. And what you're saying is it's much more complicated than that. And it's not, as you say, it's not a linear progression in any way. As you've mentioned Dugin, who's often referred to as Putin's philosopher, and you also mentioned the spiritual dimension that Putin begins to invoke, perhaps in his second mandate. I just wanted to sort of pause on this idea of a spiritual dimension to what Putin is talking about, because I think, we in the West might feel it was a cliche to talk about, Russian spirituality or, the Russian soul or Russian identity in some kind of essentialist way. But really, if you look in Dugin's writing, there are elements of those things. So how much is Putin playing on this idea of a sort of distinct Russian spiritual sense, would you say?
Well, in fact, it's interesting because the concept of spirituality in Russian duhovnost is not new in Russian politics. Actually, it has a long history that goes back even to the Soviet times. And for instance, a scholar like Kati Rusli has shown that this concept was used by Soviet officials, in particular during Brezhnev's rule. And it was then meant as a secular, cultural, moral value that should replace traditional religions' functions of social integration and unification. So spirituality gradually recovered a religious dimension in the discourse of Soviet nationalists and conservative intellectuals who had rediscovered the pre-revolutionary Slavophile philosophy. And in today's Russia, spirituality and spiritual values have indeed become increasingly central in Vladimir Putin's speeches. And even if we look at official policy documents or, for instance, the national strategy doctrines, they do recognize a quote-unquote spiritual sovereignty that is defined as the country's core set of religious and traditional values, and they attribute to this spiritual sovereignty a key security aspect. To them, it's one of the key dimensions of the country's national security.
At this point in my conversation with Juliette, I moved on to discuss the Izborsk Club, and we experienced some technical problems with the recording. So before resuming the interview, let me just summarise what Juliette said by way of introducing the Izborsk Club. The Izborsk Club was named after an ancient fortress near the Estonian border and was founded in 2012. It was intended, according to its website, to be a, quote, powerful political and ideological coalition of patriotic statesmen, an imperial front that opposes the manipulations of foreign centres of influence, unquote. It currently has around 60 members, including intellectuals, academics, politicians, entrepreneurs, journalists, artists, clerics, and members of the security forces. Notable figures include the economist who advised Putin on Eurasian economic integration and the Russian Orthodox cleric, reputed to be his personal confessor. The club has the support of senior members of the political elite. One such is Culture Minister Vladimir Medinsky, who will crop up later in the Ukraine story. So back now to my conversation with Juliette. Next, I asked if the Izborsk Club had much visibility with a wider Russian public.
I think that's one of the interesting dimensions of ideology in Russia today. It is, in fact, aimed at the Russian political elite rather than the general public. However, the Izborsk Club does have some public outreach, primarily because it has been actively working with the Ministry of Education on the development of patriotic education programs for young people. Also, some of the prominent club members like Prokhanov or Sergei Glaziev are very active and present in the Russian media, especially in political TV shows with mass audiences. But I would say that the primary targets for the Izborsk Club are Russia's policy circles, and the club has been supported by senior members of the political elite.
So in what ways do you see its influence in Russian politics? And if it's not really so much aimed at the public, but actually policy makers and people in power, how does that become visible or perceptible in legislation or policy directions?
Well, it is very difficult to track the influence of ideas over policy outcomes. But what we can say is that the club has enjoyed what we sociologists call the symbolic support from policy circles. So this symbolic support is demonstrated, for instance, by the fact that Andrei Turchak, who was the governor of Pskov and now the Secretary General of United Russia, has attended the inaugural ceremony of the club. And the same thing is true for the former culture minister Vladimir Medinsky, who was also there during the inaugural ceremony. So those things are public recognition of the importance of the club, provided by some high-ranked officials among policy circles. Another thing is that state sponsorships for these Izborsk Club's ideas has also been manifested through financial support. For instance, the presidential administration has funded the elaboration of the Izborsk Club's quote-unquote doctrine of the Russian world with a grant that was delivered in 2015. And also the Izborsk Club has developed a large network of offices in the Russian regions, which enable them to maintain regular contact with the governors.
It's got a view of the Russian world. It's also got a view of the Ukrainian world. And I wondered if you could say something, because you say in your article that they actually have an office in the Donbass. And I wondered, when it comes to Ukraine, what is the view that the Izborsk Club was putting out? And do you think it influenced the way Putin has really played his hand in the last half dozen years or since the invasion of Crimea?
So yes, so the annexation of Crimea was definitely a period of perfect alignment between the Kremlin strategic thinking and the Izborsk Club's ideas. However, the Izborsk Club following campaign for the Novorossia, so that's the new Russia that should have happened according to them in the Donbass. This campaign, led by the Izborsk Club, actually resulted in them parting away from the Kremlin official political line, which thought that the Izborsk Club was too radical in its support for the Donbass insurgents. So it's interesting to see that at the time in 2014, the Izborsk Club was actually very close to the Donetsk Republic government, whereas the Kremlin actually orchestrated the replacement of the founding elite of insurgent Donbass by new governments who actually agreed to sign the Minsk Protocol and give up on their claims for independence. So I think Vladimir Putin at the time was maybe dissuaded from the most radical option by Western sanctions, by the unpreparedness of the Russian economy, and also by the fact that Russia's partnership with China was still in the making. In 2016, actually, we see that state sponsorship practices for civil society organization shifted away from conservative authoritarian groups to rather promote liberal technocratic groups as a counterbalance. So in that sense, this is what I was describing earlier, that there has been up and down cycles in the Izborsk Club's influence. But one thing that remained constant was the fact that it had support from the key conservative members in the ruling elites.
And so in the period before the invasion of Ukraine, how did you read its influence? Did you think its influence was at a high point, or was it a relatively low point?
Well, so that's the most surprising part of it. Actually, the influence of the Izborsk Club, as I said, was going through up and down cycles. And in most recent years, they had actually been quite isolated from influential power centers. For instance, the presidential administration had persistently declined all of the club's call for financial grants since 2016. From what I read from the Izborsk Club's members' reaction to what happened in February 22, to their reaction to the invasion of Ukraine, they were surprised themselves to see such a radical turn enacted by the Kremlin. Of course, they regarded this as a positive evolution. They called it a revolution from above, but they have admitted that it occurred contrary to their own expectations.
Because they had been very much in favour of armed intervention in the Donbass. Had they been explicit about exactly what kind of status they thought Ukraine should have, the members of the club? Or was that more opaque?
No, I haven't read anything specific about the status that Ukraine should eventually have. I have read in 2014 an article by the Izborsk Club vice director, Alexander Nagorny, which was entitled The Stalinian Receipt. And it was actually describing in details the military invasion of Ukraine. It was prescribing a military invasion of Ukraine and explaining in details what actually happened 8 years later. So that is airstrikes on strategic targets, deploying the Russian military in Ukraine, but also calling for voluntaries. So many things that actually happened, but that was back then considered as too radical by the Kremlin.
And you've said that the club doesn't have a particular public face. So at the moment in the Russian media, would you hear members speaking up and giving their opinion, or is it a quieter sort of position that they take than that?
No, they are active in the Russian media these days. Most prominently, some of the most popular figures like Prokhanov, Dugin. Dugin, I don't think he's in the general public media. He has been banned actually from Russian public TV in 2014 because he was judged too radical. But Prokhanov, certainly Averyanov as well, and all the members of the Izborsk Club are out there in the media, but also in social networks. And you can tell, yes, that they have aggregated a certain audience that's now, representing those ideas and spreading them and using them as a way to justify retrospectively what happened.
And when you, as a Russian specialist, listen to commentary coming out of the Kremlin, what kind of signs are you picking up as far as Putin's intentions or who he's listening to, or whether there might be there's clearly been an evolution in his war aims. They've changed quite a lot in the last week or so. But with your sort of specialist knowledge, what kind of things do you pay attention to when you hear a statement or a speech or a position that's coming from the Kremlin these days?
So, for instance, one thing that I found very interesting was the fact that Vladimir Medinsky was appointed as the head of the Russian delegation charged with negotiation with Ukraine, because obviously he has no experience in diplomacy or international relations so far. So that means that this choice is for other reasons. So apart from his experience, because he has known in this domain. So what's interesting in this case is that apparently he was appointed because the Kremlin wanted to rely on a fully ideologically convinced representative, because Vladimir Medinsky was one of the long-time Izborsk Club loyalists, and he's regarded as one of the most conservative members of the Russian elite. So to me, these are some of the interesting signs that are coming from the Kremlin, and that help to analyze where the wind is shifting. And in terms of vocabulary and lexicon used by Vladimir Putin, it's interesting to see, even before the invasion, his article in July 2021 about the unity of the Russian and the Ukrainian people was already using some of the characteristic language of the Izborsk Club that I had seen earlier in some of the articles of the club. So that is his thesis about the so-called I don't think he's using genocide in this article, but that he's using the term Russophobia, which is a very, very key word for all of this national patriotic environment. The fact that a genocide is supposedly being perpetuated upon Russian minorities outside in the post-Soviet states. So these key words, these key theses that have been developed for the past 30 years by those national patriotic groups and are now becoming incorporated in official speech. Another interesting thing that happened very recently was the article that was published on the website of RIA Novosti, who's like the official mouthpiece of the regime, like the journal associated to the Ministry of Communication, the Russian Ministry of Communication, and this article about the complete eradication of Ukraine as a state was horrific because of its very radical and brutal way of praising violence and praising war against Ukraine and ultimate destruction of Ukraine. The fact that such an article is now published in mainstream official media, whereas before it was actually the discourse of extreme marginalized people, I think is interesting to see this career of ideas from the fringes to the mainstream of the public sphere.
And when you get to the stage that Putin is using this worldview as a justification for war, that cycle of the up and down that you described, you can no longer go through that because he's bet everything on it, hasn't he? He's sort of gone all in. There's no more sort of dissolution between him and that ideology. He's going to be identified with it forever now, isn't he? No matter what the outcome is for him or for Russia or for Ukraine, he's sort of nailed his colours to that mast.
Yes, that's also the way I see it. I think this invasion of Ukraine signaled the evolution of the Russian political system from a hybrid authoritarianism that rested on political flexibility, on plural ideological factions, to the implementation of a full-fledged repressive uniformization of an imperialist state culture. So indeed, I think there's no way back, because this is not something you can change. I mean, whereas Vladimir Putin was, attentive to keep this political flexibility, now he's made a choice that with no way back. However, what's also interesting is to see that, again, he's sort of practicing this policy of blending different types of political elites, because he has on one side Vladimir Medinsky as the head of the Russian delegation in charge of negotiations with Ukraine, and on the other side, what we've seen recently is the influence of the oligarch Roman Abramovich, who's been now included in the negotiation processes, and that shows that the so-called economic pragmatists also retain some influence over the Kremlin.
I was speaking to Juliette Faure, whose article in this month's paper is entitled "The Deep Ideological Roots of Russia's War." You can read it at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back 25 years, as well as exploring other resources, such as the podcast archive and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.